Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is the third webinar of our webinar series devoted to crowdsourced and deliberative constitution-making processes. In the first session, we analyzed the concept of crowdsourced constitutionalism with Anthony Abati-Ninette. Yesterday, we had Sergio Verdugo, who offered the fantastic overview of the constituent process in Chile. And today, we have another amazing scholar, namely Veronica Federico, who is a professor of comparative public law at the University of Florence, where she also teaches the comparative, the constitutional and European law. She obtained their PhD from the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. She worked at the Boston College, at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She has led many important international projects, including Horizon 2020 project, so big money. She's a great researcher. She's also a friend, and she's one of the most important, voices in comparative constitutional law, especially when you want to understand how the South African constituent process worked. Indeed, I mean, South Africa perhaps cannot be traced back to the concept of crowdsourced, the constitution making process, but it has been a lab for those interested in open, negotiated, and multi-stage constituent processes, and that's why it was an obvious interlocutor. And we immediately thought of Veronica. I'm also speaking on behalf of the other co-director of the course, Matteo Monti, as she has written very important things in this area. And I'm super duper happy that she immediately accepted our invitation. It means a lot to me, and I'm sure that our participants will benefit enormously from her knowledge. Having said that, thank you so much, Veronica. Ready where you are.
Well, Giuseppe and Matteo, thank you for the invitation. I think that the introduction by Giuseppe is far too generous. But yet, let's do not get into this again. But I'm really pleased of being here with you today. For at least two reasons. The first one is, and let's put people before academic stuff. So the first one is because I've known Giuseppe since quite a long time, but and he has invited me a number of times, and because of a multiple, let's say, reasons, I've never been able to accept. So this year I really told to myself, if Giuseppe invites me, whatever it happens, I have to say yes. So, and then it happened on a topic that is the second reason why I'm so happy of being here with you. That means on South Africa. It's quite a long time. I'm not really going back with my thought and with academic research on the constitution making process in South Africa, and I've been working on the 30 years after the constitutional transition, and on the effect of what happened and how the democratic system and the constitutional institution are working today. And because when, as we will see at the end of my discourse, when we go 30 years after, we have a sort of disenchantment. I'm really happy of going back 30 years before, And this is to say that I'm pretty old, because I was part of the, I mean, I remember very clearly what was happening at the time. So it means I'm old enough, you know, to have passed, to have sailed across those years. But still there was at the time so much enthusiasm, not simply in South Africa and in Africa, but all over the world, for the constitution making process in South Africa. That was really a landmark process for the idea of, and here I borrow Cass Sunstein's expression, for the idea of using constitution making in order to allow peacemaking processes, so that the constitution debate became a sort of, of support for civilizing harsh political and social conflicts. And I think this is one of the reasons why I decided as a person to engage into comparative public law. I have always been interested, for a number of reasons, since I was a teenager, on South Africa politics. And I was an activist. I subscribed to the ANC abroad when I was something like 15, so a long ago, in the mid of the 80s. And I got involved into the political battle of the South African transition. And looking at what was happening, I really remained fascinated by the power, for, in concrete terms, not in abstract terms, of what the comparative and especially the constitutional law can do in designing new democracies, in supporting the political, let's say, long march toward freedom and empowerment. Obviously, this enthusiastic approach, which was the approach I had in my teenagerhood, as left, and has disappeared long ago with that disenchantment. But going back to the constitution making process in South Africa really gives me this, at least a reminiscence of that spirit and of that motivation, why we should really get engaged with constitutional law in books, but also in action. So thank you so much, Matteo and Giuseppe, for having brought me back 30 years ago, and for having helped me to, to renew my enthusiasm in this field of research. And you know better than I do that sometimes you need, to revitalize enthusiasm, because the academic life is complex, and because life is complex per se. So without any further delay, and without digging too much into my private life, which is not the object, I'm just saying that before we start, so before I start sharing the screen, please feel free, in any case, for whatever reason, either because my English is incomprehensible, or because there is something that sounds odd to you, or because the line is not getting very nicely, to unmute yourself and to interrupt me. So this is a substantial claim and not a formal one. So please do so. I'm starting sharing the screen, and let's start without any further delay, because otherwise we get too late. I love talking. Okay, so why is it I don't want this? Okay, I want this. So okay, this is the outline of what we will discuss together today. So at first, just because this happened a long ago in the early 90s, where I suppose that the large majority of you was not born yet. So I will provide you a hopefully quick overview of what was South Africa like at the beginning of the 90s. Then I will discuss with you the complexity of the constitution making process. Thirdly, we will see into more details what does it mean public participation and whether this meant people's ownership on both the process and the Constitution. And thirdly, and I promise just by one slide, we will do a sort of 3 decades later picture in order to see what happened in the medium period run to that process. In doing this, I will be supported by this instrument that is WorkLab. So I would ask all of you, either through the PC that you are using, to device that you are using to follow this course, or by the mobile phone, to go to WorkLab and to enter the event code. This is quite useful because, as you will see in a few minutes, you will have part in the presentation. So there will be, I will pose you some questions, and through WorkLab, I will collect your answer. Moreover, so just let me know if you've done it. As of today, there are just 7 people connected. So I'm waiting for more to get connected, please. And I promise they won't be too many questions open to you, but it also helps keeping, the attention high. So also for those that haven't had enough coffee and may feel a bit sleepy during my presentation, I hope there won't be so many, but yet this will help us.
I'm trying, but it's not working. Well, in any case, it's that I will be your worst student, but just to say that in my case, it's not working. But
this is really, let's say if I can copy the link, and let's see if I can send it to you.
Yeah, let's see. But I mean, of course, the priority, of course, goes with students. So if our participants manage to join WorkLab, then it's fine.
So I'm disclosing the email publicly, but I'm sending the link. Let's see if
Great, thank you.
And let's go back here. Okay, as you will see at the top here, there is a button for saying that, ooh, I'm confused. If I see that more than 2, I hope those, okay, here you are 3, 2. So if you click the button, I'm confused. It means that I'm not really working nicely, and I will stop and I will ask you why you are confused. Right? Okay. So let's start by saying that I am using the notion today of public participation and not crowdfunding. Professor Martinico has already mentioned this. And this is a bit of, let's say, a conceptual, not completely and fully overlapping because between the two of them. Yet I decided to keep on using the notion of public participation and not, let's say, reinterpreting the South African process through this rather new notion of crowdfunding for a few reasons. The first one is because I am a bit of a simple mind. And so I find the notion of public participation more intelligible to my knowledge and to the way I portray constitution making processes. Secondly, and most importantly, is because the notion of public participation was the one used by both constitution makers, the general public, and by, let's say, scholarship at the time the South African transition took place. So, and I think that if we try to be fair with those stream of analysis, I think we should keep on using those very same notion, not to lose the pregnancy, the significance of those notion. So what I would say is that today we will focus on public participation, that we can assume as being a sort of a proxy for crowdfunding, but you know better than I do the differences. So please bear in mind this this tiny conceptual gap that still exists and that we cannot fully ignore. When we talk about public participation in constitution making, we can have a number of ways in which this public participation happens. And a number of ways in this public participation happened and in several constitution making processes, not simply in Africa, but throughout the world. You know better than I do that there is much literature on this. This means that the theoretical implications of the conceptualization of public participation is really a quite, let's say, a quite studied field. So I'm not reinventing the wheel now, and I'm not re-proposing you a new conceptualization, simply saying that public participation may go from simple voting and a constitutional referendum, or participating to an assembly, as we say here, a caucus, or take part of a political campaign, or lodge a constitutional a constitutional suggestion, either by post, that was the case in South Africa, early 90s, so there was not yet the email and internet service full working, or by, as it happened in South Africa, phoning to the constitutional talk line, as we will see later on. So there is a multiplicity of ways in which people may be called to take part of the designing of the institution of and of the value of their countries. Which are the conditions that should exist according to you for participation to be effective? Take a time to think about it. Should we put more attention to political conditions, meaning that there should be, the most crucial aspect is the political condition, or the socio-economic context, or media freedom, or the capacity of people to participate? So you mentioned that for you, political condition and media freedom prime over the socio-economic context, and definitely citizen education, is the least important one. Indeed, in the South African context, at the eve of the transition, all those elements, were ripe enough, mature enough to make public participation blossoming in its most, let's say, powerful way. At the time, again, I'm sorry, but we need to go a bit back in history, the country was living a creeping civil war between the government of Pretoria, that was the government of apartheid, so definitely an oppressive government that denied the large part of the population the most fundamental rights. There was a very heavy economic crisis due to the fact that the country was a country that was a highly industrialized one. So it was not, it was, and it is still not simply a producer of basic, resources, as the large majority of primary, economic resources, such as the large majority of the African countries, but it produced a highly sophisticated product. Due to the sanction that the international community advocated for during especially the 80s, the external market was rather close to South Africa, and South Africa had to use and the South African economic system had to rely mainly on the internal market. But the internal market was mainly made of a very, very small portion of the population, because as we will see, or I can anticipate it to you, that at the beginning of the 90s, the composition of the population in South Africa was like that, about 40 million people, of which 75% Black people, 15% white people, almost 9% the colored population, and 2.5% the Asian population. Of this, the portion of the population that could have fully citizenship and a true what does colored means? Okay, Patrick. Colored as a racial category that was elaborated by the South African government to encompass either people of a mixed race, so those that were born out of a marriage between Black and white, but also of the, let's say, native South African population that was not made of Black people, but was the, let's say, the descendants of the Khoisan population, what we name in Europe Bushmen and Hottentots, and part of the Malay, so people coming from Malaysia that were transposed in South Africa by the British colonies. Whereas in the Asian population counts the large majority of the Indian population, again, that the British Empire brought to South Africa. Just a small, let's say, a cameo to remember you that Mahatma Gandhi has started his non-violent campaign exactly in South Africa, fighting against the racial discrimination against the Asian population in South Africa. Given to that, well, happy to have answered, Patrick. So, because of that, the economic system went into a heavy economic crisis, which means that the Pretoria government was strongly under pressure to change the political setting. Moreover, at the beginning of the 90s, again, you are too young to remember that, but I'm sure you've studied it in your history exam. There was the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which means that the East-West contraposition decreased dramatically. For almost 50 years, South Africa have been a sort of fortress in Africa for the anti-communist war. I know that this language may appear to you as, a language of last century. And indeed, it is last century language. But this is one of the reasons why Western political system, Western countries, and even Western European countries largely supported the apartheid regime, despite the fact that it was systematically violating fundamental rights of the people. Due to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was no more the reason for a strong contraposition between East and West. And this meant that the increasing international support for the anti-apartheid movement could gain support also from government, from Western government. And this was another very, very relevant push towards the South African government to negotiate with the anti-apartheid movement. A fourth reason was that the country, at the time, from the mid of the 80s onwards, was highly fragmented. The apartheid regime, as we will see in 2 seconds, had created a number of puppet, Bantu, self-regulating areas, or even autonomous countries that were recognized exclusively by South Africa, where the Black population was supposed to enjoy their citizens' right while being denationalized in South Africa. Therefore, there was a political and institutional fragmentation on the country, and moreover, due to the creeping civil war, the anti-apartheid, and the war against the anti-apartheid movement, these creeping civil wars made the country being strongly ungovernable. At the time, there were numbers of non-go areas and many outskirts around the large cities of South Africa. There were, battlegrounds, but physically battlegrounds. So there was really a war going on. And obviously, the South African government could not, last long with that kind of internal condition. And finally, there was a highly politicized civil society. This may appear sort of an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. But the fact that the anti-apartheid movement on the one hand and the apartheid government on the other both required the support of the people meant as well that the level of political consciousness in the country was extremely high. And this was a perfect precondition for public participation. Are you familiar with the notion of apartheid? Have you ever heard about apartheid? Okay, great. I take it as it was for the large majority. So I will go very quickly on this part of my presentation. So I just recall you quite, again, swiftly what apartheid meant at the time. The idea that the society should develop separately according to the color of the skin of the people. And the sign of the what was named petty apartheid, so the small apartheid, is the one that you see in this picture. Benches for non-white only, beaches for white only, and drinking fountain on the one side for white, on the other for colored. But the apartheid was far more than that. And I very quickly recall you that since 1950, with the Population Registration Act, each South African was registered as belonging to a racial group, and the racial group were four: white, black, colored, Asian. And according to the group in which the person was registered, that person was supposed to live in a given area of the country, was supposed to be employed, was supposed to undergo a particular education system, because obviously Black people were to be educated for the position they should have occupied in society and no more than that. And according to the racial belonging, people could marry with other people, or having sexual intercourses with other people. You know, having sexual intercourses among race was a criminal offense. Moreover, and Black people, all not just Black people, but all non-white people since 1952 had to have a pass, that means an internal passport, always with them to justify the fact of entering into a white area. So it was a highly divided society, strongly militarized. Since the Suppression of Communism Act, all opposition parties and movements were banned, and belonging to not just to the Communist Party, but to any anti-government political movement was a criminal offense. People could be detained 180 days incommunicado, so without the right to communicate with family, with lawyers, with doctors, and this period could be renewed for indefinite time. So it was a very highly militarized, highly politicized society in which people could develop within their racial groups. Moreover, since the late 50s, non-white people were granted local authorities, meaning that there were local authorities for Black people. It was named Bantu at the beginning. And then local authorities for colored, local authorities for Asian. With the Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act 1970, there were the creation of homelands, areas, geographical regions in which formally the non-white population were confined to live. And entering a Bantu self-government area was usually, announced by this kind of sign in the street: caution, beware of natives. This meant the fact that the Bantu, the non-white population, lost 1970 the South African citizenship. And this was an extremely powerful instrument to finally craft, the 2 decades of the apartheid regimes. You may recall here some of Hannah Arendt's discourse about the denial of the citizenship for the Jewish population during the Nazi regime. And indeed, scholarship in South Africa at the time has used Hannah Arendt's paradigm pretty much to explain the process that the South African government, the Pretoria government, and I'm using this expression Pretoria government because the executive capital in South Africa is Pretoria, exactly as the same mechanism that was used by the government of apartheid. All this, and this is crucial, All this done through the law. The apartheid system was let's say, an undemocratic system that was fully based on acts of parliament. When we think about, undemocratic regime, for example, in other African countries or in Latin Americas, we think about contra legem acts made, de facto by the military, by the leading political parties, but done against the formal law. The particularity of the apartheid regime was that all the regulation, all the oppressive regulation was exactly institutionalized by acts of parliament duly approved by the parliament that was democratically elected, obviously just by the white population, who was the sole owning the right to vote, the franchise. And I just recall you that in South Africa, the right to vote for women was granted very early in the 90s. It was granted in 1920. So really very early, but it was instrumental. It was a sort of a right to vote to white women in order for the regime to show its democratic openness and to fight against the black peril. So the idea of granting the right to vote for women against the denial of the right to vote for the native population. Against this background, the large part of the population, not simply the black part of the population, but also a good share of the white population too got involved into the struggle, what was named the struggle. That is, political movements that stood up against the apartheid regime. The most important and the most famous political movement was the ANC, the African National Congress, but it was not the sole one. I put here the picture of Steve Biko. A number of you may know the Peter Gabriel song, Biko. If you don't, this is a must. So is a sort of homework I'm giving you. Go on whatever platform you use and listen to the Biko song by Peter Gabriel. It's a beautiful song, and it really tells you the story of this activist of the Black consciousness movement who was killed to death and tortured to death in the prison of Port Elizabeth, a town in southeastern South Africa, because he was a militant leader of the Black consciousness movement that struggled against the apartheid regime in a more muscular way, in a more, advocating as well for political violence. And at that time, the ANC was not advocating for. You may be familiar as well with the other picture, the one that is here at the center, with children and teenagers, shot dead by the police. That was the picture of the Soweto uprising, 1973, when pupils, so primary and secondary school children rose against the decision by the government of Pretoria to impose Afrikaans, that is the language of a part of the white population, as vehicular language for the Bantu education. So Black people had to be taught in Afrikaans. That was the language of the oppression. They rose against it. The police shot dead a number of them. Since early 1973, a mass boycotts of the school went on. And this causes today quite a number of problems, because you have let's say, a generation of Black people that have not attended formally school because of that boycott. But the struggle is not simply a political struggle, but the struggle started to use the law to oppose the regime. So, on the one hand, we see that the apartheid government used the law to oppress and to deny the right of the non-white population. But on the other hand, we see clearly that the liberation movement, the opposition, was very familiar with the empowering status that, the Bill of Rights, that a certain institutional design can grant to the people. And that's why part of the struggle was also, since the very beginning, since the 1950s, aiming at building up an alternative legal system for a future South Africa. The picture here are the picture that represent the first bottom-up African Bill of Rights, that is the Freedom Charter, that was built up in a, let's say, in a fully participatory, before even the concept of participatory and, deliberative democracy was conceived, because it was 1950, in the suburbs around Johannesburg, where a number of activists have been physically walking throughout all South Africa to collect people's wills, and then in a huge assembly in Kliptown, that is a tiny suburbs and in the outskirts of Johannesburg, meeting and writing down this sort of Bill of Rights for this the South African Black population, the Freedom Charter. So you see, already since the very beginning of the apartheid story and of the struggle against apartheid, the law was a battleground, was both an instrument for oppression and an instrument for emancipating. I'm getting confused with the English. Please bear with me. So, to cut the story short, and I'm ready to go back, and I'm sorry if I've been a bit confused, but, synthesizing those years in few words is not easy. So please, if everything is not clear, we will go back to that in the Q&A session. But let's now quickly move to the transition in order to arrive to get to the real core business. And I promise I have something like 10, 15, 20 minutes more to talk, and then I'll stop. And if I don't do so, please, Giuseppe and Matteo, give me a sign like that, and I will quickly.
I will.
Okay, great. So, the transition moved on very, very quickly. The situation at the end of the 80s was so severe, and the political, cultural situation was so ripe, so mature, that the transition really took place in few years. Obviously, we generally, the scholars and also public, let's say, the public discourse on the transition takes the 2nd of February 1990 as the kickoff of the transition. Indeed, hidden negotiations have been taking place for at least 4 or 5 years prior to the 2nd of February 1990. And there were hidden, negotiations either in prisons or outside South Africa to prepare both the leadership and the economic community and the civic leadership of the countries, churches, trade unions, cultural movements, in order to prepare the transition. Yet, the first step was a unilateral step undertaken by the government with the unbanning of the National Liberation Movement. So, we see that since the 1950 Suppression of Communist Act, all the opposition parties and movements have been banned. After 40 years, they were allowed to go back on the political arena. This was followed very quickly to the political prisoners' release. I am sure you are all familiar with the picture of the release of Nelson Mandela. He walking out of the prison, he was no more in Robben Island. He was kept in a prison in Cape Town at the time. Walking out of the prison hand in hand with his wife, Winnie Mandela. Nelson Mandela was strongly pressured not to be released publicly, but he strongly refused. That's why as well, this gap in between the 2nd of February and the 11th of February. Those 9 days have been 9 days of highly and hot negotiations. The government was ready to release Nelson Mandela in the evening of the 2nd of February, should he have accepted to step out of the prison in silence. He didn't. After that, quite interestingly, in order to get the support to enter into formal negotiation, the government of Pretoria asked to the white population whether they agreed to enter into negotiation. This is a unicum in the constitutional transitions in Africa. That is a white-only referendum that the government asked to its citizens. Remember, at the time, just white people could vote, had the right to vote. So we can say that this white-only referendum is the first step into a participation program by the South African government, asking to their people whether they agreed or not to enter into negotiation. If I'm not wrong, please check it on Google, because I'm not an encyclopedia, so I may be wrong, and I haven't double-checked this afternoon, so please bear with me. But I would say that more than 90% of the white people voted in favor for opening to negotiation. This means as well that, as I was telling you, that the situation was really ready for the negotiations. And then we enter quickly into the constitution-making process. That is the first round of negotiation, the CODISA 1, 2, and the multi-party negotiation forum. We will go back in this in more details. Second step, the approval of the interim constitution. Then the first democratic election, April 1994, with the establishment of the national unity government, and finally the approval of the final constitution 2 years later, 10 December 1996. Which were the issues at stake at the moment of the opening of the negotiation? there were a number of very, very critical conundrums. First of all, who was legitimized to negotiate? The South African government solved the question with the white-only referendum. But do you remember that it was just 12% of the population that was white and had the right to vote? What about the other 90, the other, large majority of 88% of the population? They were not allowed to vote. The system was not ready to prepare for election at the time. So that was an issue to be solved. Were the National Liberation Movement legitimate enough to negotiate for the whole South African non-white population? The second conundrum, what constitutional model? Which kind of institutional design, South African constitutional drafting we're imagining? Third conundrum, how to redress the imbalances of the past. There were political imbalances, socio-economic one, should they go for example, the complete expropriation of white properties as Zimbabwe did, with, for example, land ownership 2 decades later? And fourthly, what to do with the crimes that were committed during apartheid? How to lead the country into a national pacification process? Which were the goals of this process? So those were the issue at stake, the goals. Keeping the country together. For those of you that are old enough to remember, exactly at the same time, Europe, early 90s, experiences the war in former Yugoslavia, an experiment of a federal country that was dissolved because a number of ethno-national revanchism was stronger than the idea of keeping a country together. It was not as simple as that. I'm sure that both Giuseppe and Matteo would think of the portrait of the former Yugoslavia as being extremely oversimplistic, but this is just to set the scene and to tell what was happening exactly at those times. So the question of keeping the country together was crucial. At the same time, there was another crucial question: keep the economy going. The country could not go bankrupt. The whole democratic transition would have failed if the country would have gone bankrupt. This meant, a lot of compromise with the white population. But the third goal that was absolutely crucial, at least as much as the other two, was to ensure at last fundamental rights to all South Africans. How? Keeping the three together. So, what was the South African solution? South African solution was basically grounded on 3 pillars. A 2-step constitution-making process, and this 2-step constitution-making process was aiming at solving the first 2 conundrums: who is legitimate to negotiate and which constitutional model adopting. And then we have the public participation process. And this leads again to the legitimacy, but also to the way of redressing the imbalances of the past. And finally, the transitional justice based on a truth and reconciliation commission that is a system of, getting to terms with the past of apartheid in a non-criminal way, in a third way, neither criminal nor amnesty, but a reconciliatory, retributive justice. This is a very interesting process. I'm not going into it today. I already see Giuseppe, frightened by me started talking about the TRC. I'm not talking about that, but Giuseppe, that could be, and Matteo, could be a fascinating topic, talking
Indeed.
about transitional justice for the, but not me talking, but meaning in a comparative perspective. This is, and this is an extremely interesting part. So, you see, to complex problems, South African responded to complex solutions, making the roadmap towards a democratic constitutional system more complex than it could have been, exactly to hold the country together, to ensure the feasibility, the economic stability of the country, the sustainability of the system from an economic perspective, and for ensuring the ownership of the people over their right. The two steps constitution making. What does it mean? It means that the constituent power, what in doctrines we say, we name the constituent power, that is that spirit that designs the institutional setting and the constitutional values of a country, is not simply, does not simply works for a limited period of time, but gets diffused a long time in a complex process. In a way, we can say, I'm not sure this is an English word. Please correct me if it is not English. A diluted constituent power. Two are the final documents. The first one, you find it on the left-hand side, is the interim 1993 interim South African Constitution. The second one, the right-hand side, is the final 1996 Constitution. The two documents talk to each other, but are absolutely two different constitutions. The first one, as we will see in a second, is the final product of the first step of the constitution making process. The second one is the product of the whole constitution making process. Both of them are fully working constitutions. Let's see what led to the approval of the interim constitution and to the first democratic election. This is the first step. Remember, we are in 1992. No right to vote for the African population, no possibility to organize any kind of referendum and for the large majority of the African population. The National Liberation Movement were unbanned since just 2 years. This meant that obviously they earned a long, and heavy legitimacy because they have been fighting for long years, for decades, against the South African regime, but yet no one could really weight their power in terms of consensus. Who then should sit at the constitution-making table? This is not a trivial question. The South African solved that question by organizing three, indeed it's 2 + 1, but we can say 3 national large conventions that were named Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA 1, 2, and then multi-party negotiation process. Those were very large conventions to which all civil society associations that were willing to participate could join. At the table in CODESA 1, there were almost 20 entities from the South African government, obviously the National African Congress, the South African Communist Party, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the National Indian Congress, the Colored People Congress, and these were the most important national liberation movements. But you could find there as well the Black Sash, for example, a women's league, a white women's league that was created in the 1950s to support the families, the single women whose husbands were jailed because of being political opponents. So mainly, a self-help, a female self-help organization. There were in CODESA 1, 2, and in the multi-party negotiation process, the Council of the Churches. Quite a good friend of mine was the friend of Bishop Tutu, who died, was it last year or the year before? Well, he died very, very recently. I've written an obituary for him. And he was part of the CODESA. So it was a very, very large and extended convention that was negotiating the constitution. You find here in the slide a red arrow, and the red arrow is a sign for public participation. In this case, the participation of the South African citizenry was not a direct participation. People could not lodge a constitutional request directly. Too early. Imagine that the South African government didn't know exactly the size of the Black population. They had not the civil registry for the Black population. So it was very, very difficult to organize whatever different, participation process. So the idea was a sort of indirect participation with all the entities that took part to the negotiation having a mandate of representing their constituency. It was a long process. It was a long process marked by a number of stop and goes. You may remember the killings of Chris Hani, that was the leader of the South African Communist Party, in front of his house in Soweto, that is the largest township in South Africa. And when I say township, it means the town of the non-white population. And this has created awful turmoils. And a number of other deaths and the stopping of the negotiation for 2 months and a sort of return of violence. And then it took time to go back to the negotiation table. This process produced one document made of two, let's say, elements. Interim constitution, so a fully fledged constitution that was supposed to govern the country during the second step of the constitution making process, and 34 constitutional principles. This document, quite curiously, was presented in the South African Parliament for its approval. This was a strongly request by the Pretoria government as a sign of state continuity. The Parliament endorsed the Constitution in December 1993. This marked the opening for the first democratic election that were held from 24 to 27 April 1994. With the election, the first step of the constitution-making process was closed. But there is this issues. I told you, think about the question. I told you that the output of the negotiation was a document with two elements, an interim constitution and 34 constitutional principles. Do you have any clue of what constitutional principles are?
Yeah, I think democratic principle and fundamental rights.
No, well, yes. Yes, who is that? Giulia.
Yeah, weren't they supposed to be like fundamental principles like fundamental rights, democratic ideas that would lead the way to the subsequent constitution?
Great. Giulia got the right answer. So, a number of principles, among which the respect for fundamental rights that were not fully named in the principles, but still that they were recalled, among which definitely somebody just wrote equality, definitely, but also a number of institutional design. Those principles are exactly what Giulia mentioned. A number of criteria that should lead the second part of the constitution making. But this should pose you some other issues. Those of you that are familiar with the notion of constituent power should know that per se, when we talk about definition, constituent powers has no limits, isn't it? As a sort of free expression of the will of the people of a country. This sounds a bit romantic, a bit 19th century, declaration, but it's true. The constituent power per se should have no limits. Whereas the whole second part of the constitution making process in South Africa was carried out based on those principles. And furthermore, the newly created Constitutional Court was called to verify that the final constitution would respect those principles. So a sort of constitutional check over the Constitution. Obviously, this would really question you, saying, what about this second step? Can we really name this second step as an expression of constituent power? Or is not just a constitute power? And indeed, South Africans question this as well. Because, and I go back to sharing, so I try to keep you, awake. Let's see if we can move. Okay, now we go. Okay, we are here in the second step. If you can read, I've written it very in small, font. But if you read the name of the assembly that had the power to write the final constitution, it was named Constitutional Assembly and not Constituent Assembly. So what happened in this second step? The 1994 election elected a parliament whose large majority was composed of Black people representing the leading anti-apartheid movement, the African National Congress, the ANC, the Nelson Mandela movement, and then it became a party. Nelson Mandela became the first elected state president. And the country was ruled by a government of national unity, having two vice presidents, the former president of the apartheid regime, Frederick de Klerk, the one that I've portrayed in a picture somewhere, here, this guy here, and the second vice president was the second in chief in the ANC, Thabo Mbeki, that was the subsequent president of the South African government. The parliament was at the same time, as it happened in Italy, a parliament doing his parliamentary job and an assembly called to write the final constitution. Here you see the second red arrow. Second strong injection of public participation. This time, the public participation program was massive, and it massively called and involved the people. Hundreds of meetings were held by committees made up of MPs, members of parliament, throughout the country, especially in rural areas. And astonishingly enough, many, many people participated. South Africans, even in remote areas, were deeply willing of being part of that process. So when at first I asked you whether, people's citizens' education was crucial or not, well, citizens' education is indeed crucial in order to have an effective public participation. But education doesn't mean necessarily the capacity of writing and reading, but rather the capacity of understanding what's going on. South African society, because of the struggle, because of the long years of opposition against apartheid, and because of the long years of the apartheid for the white population, was a highly politicized society, where the level of awareness of the people, even in the remote areas, even for destitute people, was very, very high. Therefore, people participated. And people participated in those organized programs, but people sent as well planes to the South African Constitutional Assembly, wrote letters, mobilized. There were groups that there were more able than others to mobilize. For example, what we will name today LGBTQ+ community had a lot of resources, as well of intellectual resources, to mobilize. And they're strongly lobbied in the Constitutional Assembly to have a very strong let's say, equality clause, non-discrimination clause, based not on sex, but on sexual orientation. And that's what we have in the Constitution today. And there is a quite nice, I couldn't find it, the picture before my lesson today, but there was a very nice clip in which President Nelson Mandela rose the phone, still not the mobile phone, but the traditional one, and asking to talk with the constitutional talk line, meaning that there was an hot line, like the hot, sexy lines, dedicated, 24 hours working, dedicated to collect people's claim. A so-called, toll-free hotline to get constitutional submissions. More than 1 million submissions have been received by the Constituent, the Constitutional Assembly. If you're interested in this, and in the details of this process, I strongly recommend you a beautiful analysis of the process written by the manager of the Constitutional Assembly, that was not the Speaker of the Parliament, but the person that was managing the process, and his name is Hassan Ibrahim, and he wrote a magnificent volume saying the soul of the nation, talking about the South African Constitution and of the constitution making process. After 2 years of consultation, drafting, redrafting, and after 2 years as well of, let's say, learned tours around the war, I was talking with a constitutional judge that you may know, Albie Sachs, and he very, I would say, very naively told me, well, Veronica, we are latecomers in constitutional drafting. And because we were latecomers, we had the privilege of doing some cherry picking. So we took, for example, the federal system from Germany, and we went in Germany and we talked to people in the Länder to see how it worked. But that we were interested in the hybrid system of your Italian Constitutional Court. And we required a meeting with the Italian constitutional judges in order to understand how this hybrid constitutional vindication system works to you. And we went in India to see how it worked, their system of government. That is a re-elaboration of the Westminster model, and so on and so forth. So in those 2 years, there were, both well, a sort of three-leg process. The constitutional drafting by the constitutional assembly committees, a learned support by constitutional scholars, comparative scholars, providing for experiences throughout the whole world, and the public participation process. All this led to a first draft of the Constitution that was handled the 8th May 1996. This first draft was adopted by the Constitutional Assembly and then passed through to the Constitutional Court, newly created. Constitutional Court judged in a very long judgment, as more than 300 pages, the final constitution, and found it unconstitutional on a number of grounds. So the Constitutional Court sent back the Constitution draft to the Constitutional Assembly to rework on it. Highly sophisticated, highly proceduralized system. At that stage, no more participation. The constitution writing committees worked day and night to prepare in less than 2 months a second draft. The second draft was approved by the Constitutional Court in a much quicker and much shorter constitutional judgment. And finally, the text of the Constitution was symbolically signed on the 10th of December in Sharpeville. 10th of December, that is the Human Rights Day, and in Sharpeville, because Sharpeville was the place where there was the first massacre, massive massacre carried out by the apartheid government against the opposition parties back in 1961. So you see a highly symbolic signing of the Constitution. A Black president, Nelson Mandela, sided on the one side with the former white president on the other side, on the second-in-chief of the African National Congress, signing final constitution in a highly symbolic day, in extremely highly symbolic place. All this to keep the country together, to pacify the country through the constitution-making process, to deliver a document that could reconcile the people. So this is why, so I leave it here for you, and let me tell you the very few things. 30 years later, we see a democracy at work, definitely. A number of elections that went on with no violence, with a number of cases brought to courts, check and balances within the institution. So definitely we can name South Africa as a democratic place, but yet the opposition is still not so strong. The African National Congress still holds the large majority of the seats in parliament, and this is a danger. And we see again the corruption level that is so high, and it undermines democracy at work. Definitely, fundamental rights are there. South Africa is very, very progressive in a number of aspects, but yet people still do not have running water at home, even though at the beginning of the 20th centuries, the Constitutional Court has condemned the government because it was not able to deliver. Definitely, we have a less fragmented and polarized society. Definitely. We see that universities are deeply populated by a colored population of students. The economic world is made of, not simply of white people. Yet, the poor, the more destitute, the more uneducated sector of society remain purely Black. Finally, we see that in the last 30 years, the level of political violence has strongly decreased. Yet, what we see that has dramatically increased is the ordinary crime. So, in terms of everyday life violence, not much has changed for ordinary people in South Africa in terms of violence. And this is all.